Fine.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you all for logging on to this Zoom call. So our event today is Open Labour in Conversation with James Meadway. I hope I'm pronouncing that okay. So James is, he was a previous economic advisor to the former Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell, Chief Economist at the New Economics Foundation. He's currently writing a book on the British economy after the 2008 crisis, and appears regularly on broadcast media alternatives to the economics of neoliberalism. And he's written a lot about democratic ownership, environmental economics, automation, and the digital economy. So today we'll probably be speaking mostly about, I guess, coronavirus, and there'll be an opportunity at the end for audience members to ask questions. And also just an FYI that I only studied economics up until A-level, so my knowledge of this is shaky. I guess the first question is, the Office of Budget Responsibility has warned that Britain's economy could shrink by 35% this spring, but forecasts 10% growth for 2021. I take it from your Twitter that you disagree with this growth forecast. Would you be able to explain why?
Well, it's nonsense, and the OBR more or less say this. The bit where they say the economy is going to shrink by 35% is along the same lines as what everybody else is saying for similar economies. The forecasts from Morgan Stanley for the US are about 35% shrinking. Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis says the US economy will shrink by 50%. There's similar forecasts for Germany. So that bit is along the same lines as what everybody else is saying. The bit where afterwards they just say the economy immediately recovers. It's like dropping a rubber ball. It sort of drops, it hits the floor and it bounces straight back up again, higher than it was before, and then settles back down as if nothing had happened. It is nonsense. And the OBR say it isn't really a forecast. It's a scenario. In this case, it's the best possible case scenario for what might happen in the future. So we're extremely unlikely to hit that for a few reasons. The first one is that they basically hinge on the impact of this crisis is almost certainly going to be long-term, potentially very, very long-term. The most immediate bit, that if we imagine somehow we get a very smooth exit from the public health crisis part. So in other words, we're in lockdown at the minute and then you just turn a key and suddenly we're not in lockdown. This frankly isn't going to happen, but let's imagine it does. Even if that happens, there's so many people who have not had the money they expect coming in, that are being pushed out of work. We've seen the figures already. The coverage of the different funding schemes that's been offered to people doesn't actually cover everyone. It's significant. It's huge what the government said, but it doesn't cover everybody. Lots and lots of self-employed people in particular aren't covered. So there's all these people who've lost a lot of money, who are carrying debts. There's a potential for bankruptcies. All of these things are a drag on the economy in the sort of short to medium term on any sort of recovery. There's then the really big long-term impacts that are potentially there, like firms changing their supply chains. So at the minute you have very, very long extended supply chains across the globe, this is supposed to be efficient. In a sort of post-COVID world with the risk of pandemics and now factored into how business planning takes place, those supply chains get shrunk. You'd expect growth as a result, measured growth, to be somewhat lower. There'll be additional costs of surveillance, of monitoring, of trying to defend against any future outbreaks in the future. All of these are costs on business. All of these are dragging growth. So you'd expect some quite long-term impacts out of this. So on the whole, you wouldn't anticipate this kind of immediate response back to where we would have been anyway, that the Office of Budget Responsibility are saying is going to happen. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, had its own forecast for the world economy out today, and they basically are much more pessimistic than the OBR. They say the British economy is going to crash like every other, probably crash worse than some of the other ones, because we're going to have some of the worst impacts here out of any advanced economy in terms of the health impact of coronavirus. And then the recovery will be much slower than the OBR are forecasting. I think both of them are probably fairly optimistic in terms of what we can expect over the next period.
Sorry, I don't know if my internet's gone weird.
Oh, it's all good.
Hello, sorry.
Hello, still got you.
Yeah, okay, sorry. I think my internet's a bit weird, sorry. So you've touched upon it briefly, but where do you think the current gaps are in regards to the support the government is providing to workers during this crisis?
The gaps are, and it's been raised by the Labour front bench quite rightly, Annalise Dodds in particular, as Shadow Chancellor. The gaps are around the initial provision was only for employed workers, so it's on formal contracts basically, where you get 80% guaranteed income for 3 months. That's not actually going to be paid out until April the 20th, which is not too far off, but that is a gap in people's income. The self-employed provision is only going to kick in June, which is a very long way away. And these are people, like lots and lots of people in this country, just don't have savings for that period of time. I mean, most people actually have very, very few savings to hand, and then there's a small minority with a bit more cash. So that leaves a lot of uncertainty there. And then if you look at the provision for the self-employed, there are all sorts of strange little gaps where if you've moved into self-employment in the last year or thereabouts, you're quite likely to miss out on the support that's been offered. So it's not universal. And this is why I'd support, and a lot of people have raised, there's 160 MPs that have signed an early day motion in support of this, have raised the idea of a universal basic income. If you just pay the same amount to everyone, then you know everyone is covered. And then if people are better off, you tax them later for this. But at least you've got everybody and everything covered. And that, I think, would be the sensible way to do this. As it is, you have this quite imperfect setup for individuals. And then on companies, I think it's even worse, where you have companies, and this is going to be particularly bad for small businesses, that have cash flow problems right now because it's a lockdown, people aren't spending as much, and the government is saying, oh, well, here's a loan. Now, it's no good giving a loan to a company with a cash flow problem. They need much more support than that. They need grants, they need immediate direct government handouts. It's no good giving a company with a cash flow problem a loan. You're just contributing to their problem in the future. So the support that's being provided is significant, it's substantial, but it's not good enough. And mostly it's not good enough because in typical Treasury fashion, it's all designed to be unwound as soon as possible. They want to be able to just pull the plug in it as rapidly as they can and get everything back to what they think is normal. So that's why it's designed, and that's why it ends up with all these gaps appearing in the provision. If you introduce something like universal basic income, the big danger from the Treasury point of view is that with universal benefits, they become very popular and people sort of cling on to them. They don't want to see it taken away. So you can't get rid of it afterwards. Child benefit is an obvious example. You know, once it's introduced, it was very, very difficult for successive Conservative governments to get rid of it.
Why UBI over UBS?
Well, you do both. I mean, this is, I think it's completely sort of false opposition on these things. The advantage with UBI is that at this point in time right now, you have a lot of people who don't have the money coming in that they would otherwise expect to have and would normally anticipate having. So UBI replaces at least some part of that and does it in a fair way across everybody. So that's one bit of it. Looking ahead, I think you've got the flexibility in UBI to deal with a labour market that isn't so much built around the traditional 9-to-5 secure employment workplace practice anymore. And I don't think that's necessarily going to come back. I don't think it shouldn't be expected to come back, and I don't think it should work on the basis it will come back. So it's better to have something that can provide for lots and lots of different ways of people working in the future, and that's what UBI gives you. But in terms of UBS, you should basically do both. Like, the ideal here is to get to the point where large parts of provision is taken out of the market and put into quite a different form. So I never quite got the opposition between the two things.
So obviously right now UBI is very much in vogue, especially amongst like people on the left. Mm-hmm. Do you think that the momentum behind UBI will continue post-crisis?
I think so. And I think that one of the impacts of the crisis is that, and this is the other reason for thinking that you don't suddenly rebound back to where you were and dust yourselves down and just carry on as if nothing happened. I think political impacts of this are going to be quite significant, that we're just living through an immense demonstration of the value of public services in general, but healthcare in particular. And it's really hard politically, I would have thought, to get from a position where you've shown the value of public services. Now you might want to say, if you're the Conservative government, oh, let's get rid of it, let's cut lots and lots of things, we don't really need this. It's very hard to do that under these circumstances. And I think there's also just the revelation of what's actually important in society. The fact is that we need, fundamentally, we need things like healthcare. We need people working in shops that are selling food. We need delivery services. We need a whole load of things that are actually essential, cleaning, care work, but are completely undervalued. And the political switch that happens, where you go from a world in which you're saying some chief executive right at the top is hugely valuable, or some entrepreneur who set up God knows what, written an app or something, that's wildly valuable. Suddenly you're in a world where actually it's the fundamental, and things we always knew were valuable actually become completely unavoidable. So that's a big political shift. So I think what you probably see coming out of this is quite a revision to the political setup that we've lived with for the last 10 years, where it's like the public sector is something to always be squeezed, always be sort of looked at with a bit of resentment. And I think you're going to, and it's happening already, we're going to get to a world, I think, where it's seen as much more fundamental to how life should continue and how it's going to be from here on in.
So I think the OBR projects that we will probably go into Britain's big peacetime budget deficit. So post-crisis, do you think that this Conservative government will stay away from austerity measures? Like, we're not going to see a repeat of the Cameron years, essentially, or?
It's difficult. I think it's harder politically for them to do this in two senses. The first one is that the scale of the debt. The OBR projections are probably about right and probably somewhat on the optimistic side. So the scale they're projecting is debt to GDP, the size of the government's debt relative to the size of the economy will go above 100%. And the previous Cameron government with George Osborne, 90% was the crisis moment. Now, you can't go above 90% debt to GDP. We're going to go 100% and probably go higher than that. The deficit is going to balloon to an enormous extent. It's simply not very plausible. I mean, Paul Johnson, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, makes this point. It's just not very politically plausible to say, with a deficit so large and the debt so astronomically huge, that you're just going to cut some stuff to get rid of it. It's like you have to cut too much for this to be politically sustainable. That's a sort of optimistic view. But I think the Tories will run into something like that, particularly given their pre-COVID political setting was to basically say, we're the new Conservatives, we're not doing austerity, all these new voters we want to persuade to carry on voting for us. So to turn around and say, actually, we've got to do loads of austerity, sorry everyone, it would be politically quite risky on a fairly short-term basis. Longer term, I think there's a reset of what Conservative politics looks like around the idea that you're going to have more of a state in future, it's going to be more interventionist, and what you'll see is something closer, and you can see it developing already, closer to the kind of national conservatism you get with the Law and Justice Party in Poland or Viktor Orban's Hungary. So it's quite authoritarian, there's a big state, there's often a strong element of racism that's introduced, and that is probably where the mainstream conservatism ends up. But there will be an argument about cuts, and you can see some of it lining up already with the report from the Social Market Foundation today, the Institute of Economic Affairs last week, where they're talking about, there's an intergenerational problem. All these young people will have to pay for the care we're giving to all these old people. It's not fair. Let's get rid of pensions. So that's a sort of argument there. So there will be people trying to present that sort of case, but I don't think it'll be austerity for everyone. We're all in this together. I think it'll be you specific people are going to have to pay. And one version of that is the old versus young intergenerational inequality.
I think you tweeted earlier about this, about the Social Market Foundation's, coming out and saying that the triple lock on pensions should be removed. Could you explain your position, why you oppose that, and so on?
Well, look, Britain's pension provision is quite confused, and it's deeply sort of problematic in lots of ways. We actually have a fairly low rate of the state pension, and lots of pensioners still, despite this protection over the last few years, lots of pensioners still live in poverty. Private pension provision is hugely unequal. It's more auto-enrollment means more people have a private pension now than they used to, but the wealth that those pensions contain is skewed very heavily towards the top. So pension provision is extremely awkward and difficult, and nobody's ever really grasped the nettle in trying to reform it properly. The triple lock was introduced, frankly, it was a sort of Tory bribe, but as it's a sort of guarantee to pensioners to say that the value of your pension will always be uprated by either average earnings or the rate of inflation, or 2.5% a year. And it has meant there has been improvement in the state pension consistently during the period of austerity. So the impact of austerity has tended to fall more heavily on younger people than older people, simply because you've got this protection, but it's protection from a low base. And if you've made a promise to protect something, you shouldn't be talking about trying to get rid of it for a whole load of people with all the consequences of this, not least of which is the inequality of pensions provision, inequality amongst pensioners. If you take away the state pension, there's a lot of pensioners who carry on doing very well because they've got private provision, but a whole load of people relying on their state pension lose out. So this is why it should be considered unacceptable. over the longer term, if you're serious about trying to tackle some of these things, my own view is that something like a universal basic income is one way in which you start to cope with the fact that basically they don't have a working life which is 9 to 5 from 16 or 18 through to 65 any longer, that this isn't going to be how people are living their lives in quite the same way. But something like universal basic income is a way of allowing for the fact that people may walk in and out of the labour market, may choose to do that. We want them to be able to choose to do that, and they may carry on doing that throughout their entire life. And that would start to get rid of this sort of slightly awkward drop-off where you're working, then you suddenly retire, and to do so in a way that isn't just saying to people, you will have to work for longer. In fact, we would rather have people have some degree of flexibility about this. But this is a huge issue. And this is like reforming pensions is something that no government is ever really successfully been able to do because it affects so many people. It is incredibly difficult, complicated system to get around. There's so many different people affected in different ways. One possible advantage of what looks like a 4-year period in opposition is there might be some space to try and think about that. And I know that Johnny Reynolds, the new Shadow DWP minister, is an enthusiast for things like UBI, and I think he's quite keen and thinking quite radically about some of this stuff. So there is a potential there to build out some of these arguments, but it's going to be difficult.
So kind of going back to the issue of coronavirus and so on, the Treasury and the Bank of England have agreed to temporarily extend the use of the government's Ways and Means facility. Firstly, could you explain what that means? And secondly, if you were the government, would you use this and how? And would you use quantitative easing in addition to this?
Well, it's right. The Ways and Means facility is a slightly odd name. It's basically the government's overdraft at the Bank of England, rough equivalent. No, in fact, it's almost a direct equivalent of that. So in other words, it's the short-term loan facility from the Bank of England to the government, to the Treasury in this case, where the Bank of England says, if you need money quickly, we will extend this overdraft facility to you in order to just lend you the money straight away. Now, the difficulty here, I suppose, is in two parts. One is that the Bank of England is actually a bank. I mean, it's a central bank, so it's an unusual bank, but it is a bank. So it can do things like offer overdraft facilities, make loans, that sort of thing. The second part is because it's a central bank, it is also primarily responsible for issuing the currency that we have and setting the monetary base for all the other banks to operate. So it has this power of printing money, if you like. And when it offers an overdraft like this, it is what economists call monetary financing. Something that the governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, ruled out a couple of weeks ago. They now said basically they're going to do. So in other words, they're doing monetary financing to extend to the government the potential to give it money very, very rapidly. And the reason they want to do that is the government thinks that it's going to have an awful lot of people demanding money off it very rapidly because unemployment's going to spike. There's lots of people being furloughed. There's all these self-employed people who are going to be asking for assistance. So they need money at hand as rapidly as possible. So it's not a stupid thing to do. And it's been done before. I think the Ways and Means facility from memory was opened briefly during the 2008-9 crisis. So it's not completely unheard of to do this. The bit where it becomes more a political question is how long does this facility remain open for? Because if you keep it open a long period of time, you're offering if you like, an extension to this overdraft, and potentially indefinitely. And we don't know how long this crisis lasts for. We don't know how long the government's going to carry on doing this. And that's where it starts to turn into a question around quantitative easing. Quantitative easing actually does something very similar to this Ways and Means facility, but instead of saying, here's an overdraft, spend it on what you like to the government, quantitative easing in this country is basically used to buy government debt. So the Bank of England issues new money, goes to the market for government debt and buys that debt and holds on to it to the tune of now £425 billion. It's quite a similar operation, but instead of it being a sort of open-ended offer through the Ways and Means facility, it's quite a targeted thing where you go and buy specifically government debt. Now, there is an argument, and this is probably get into too much of the sort of technical details of it. There is an argument around, is quantitative easing just monetary financing really? Is it just the same as the Bank of England saying to government, I will buy your debt, that debt is now out of the way, I've just kind of printed money to pay for it. So there's a sort of technical argument around this. I think what we're going to see, if this crisis goes on longer than is currently being anticipated, and bear in mind the sort of projections of lockdown are quite a few months now. The Imperial College projections were basically for a 5-month period of restrictions. If it starts to go on that period of time, there will be an argument, technical, but also with a political aspect, which is like, how do we start using quantitative easing more effectively to try and support the economy? And some of that is already starting to happen.
Um, you've kind of touched upon the issue of funding, and obviously the government has their scheme if you're not if a business can't keep you on financially, or the work that you're doing you can't really do from home. But a lot of people have discovered that they can work from home. Do you think that this virus will permanently change the way people work, given sort of the innovative ways people have had to to adapt to this situation?
Yeah, look, it seems like it. The because I mean, look, one of the aspects of this is there's quite a sharp class differentiation. That if you're basically in a relatively sort of middle class job where you were normally in an office, but you can now go home and carry on doing more or less the same things, the crisis can seem not too bad, frankly, at this point in time. It's much less good if you have small children, for instance. It's much less good if you live with people who are vulnerable, that kind of thing. But you can seem quite insulated. For people who still have to work, it's been quite a sharp, horrible process. Or if you can't go to work and you can't work from home, it's even worse because you're sitting at home potentially without any cash. So there's a class differentiation there. But I do think one part of this, and it's quite speculative, but one part of it is probably going to be a permanent shift in how people work, because it's been revealed that large amounts of work can be done at home, that there is, it's often more attractive to work from home for a lot of people than having to commute and this sort of thing. There are more serious, if you like, not just people choosing to do these things, but potentially long-term costs around the organisation of businesses and supply chains and this sort of thing, that if we think in future, and something like this happened after 2008-9, the great financial crisis, where it was always sort of known that a big economic or big financial crisis could happen, but until it happens, people don't really know that it can happen. They don't factor in the costs of this. What happens after 2008-9, the costs of a huge systemic financial crisis are factored in to how banks and financial systems operate. So you change a lot of the rules, you introduce macro-prudential regulation, this sort of thing. If you take this crisis, we always sort of knew there were enough people warning. I mean, Bill Gates, all sorts of people warned about a pandemic crisis. The government ran a simulation in 2016 what would happen to the country if there was a pandemic crisis. It was known that this might happen. But until it happens, people don't know what the costs are. It's not internalized. So I think what you'll see in the future is a kind of an awareness of a pandemic risk. The risk of this happening in the future will change how people behave now. And one part of that behaviour change is probably going to be certainly less international travel for business purposes, I would have thought. But more generally, I can see a world in which there is more working from home and much less commuting and this sort of thing as part of that long-term impact of all of this.
So obviously this pandemic isn't just affecting us in the UK, it has global repercussions. Gill today has urged the government to cancel debt repayment for low-income countries. What do you think about this measure? Would you support it, and why?
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, it's one thing to talk about the sort of financial crisis here. If you talk about the global south, the issues are basically that after 2008, this economy, like most of the sort of advanced economies, the sort of older bits of capitalism, if you like, so the OECD members principally, Europe, North America, went through a period of paying off their debts. They've sort of wound down debts. Now, what's happened in the last few years that debts in this country, in the private sector, have started to build up again. Debts in the public sector never really came down too much. In the global south, there's been an explosion of debt over the last sort of 10 years or so. A lot of that's in China, but a great deal of it is outside of China, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, this sort of thing. And that's debt in the private sector in particular, but with some government debt attached. Now, these are countries with already not necessarily, in fact, mostly because they're poorer, not such robust healthcare systems. And they have governments facing large demands for debt payments. And they're now going to face a massive pandemic in which it is critically important to have a very well-funded healthcare system. I mean, we have the NHS. The NHS is barely keeping, frankly, I don't think it is keeping up with this crisis. Italy's healthcare system has been overwhelmed. Think of what might happen in that case in sub-Saharan Africa, in far poorer countries where they have healthcare systems that have been undermined systematically for a good long period of time. This is a desperate crisis. So if you're saying to these countries, in addition to all this, you have to carry on meeting your debt repayments, this is just absolutely unacceptable. The priority is funding healthcare and doing what you can about the pandemic. It is not paying debt. So of course we should write some of this debt off. This has happened before, the Jubilee debt campaign back in the 2000s. I remember Gordon Brown making the announcement that a great deal of this debt would be written off. There were some problems attached to that, but it's a very good call to make, and it's a right call to make, and let's hope the government listen to it.
So kind of building on that, what do you think a socialist recovery from this pandemic looks like globally?
Well, God, globally is a big one. I mean, one of the problems here is Gordon Brown again pointed this out, and he's right too. In 2008-9, there was a great deal of coordination amongst the different economies of the world, the major economies, through the G20 after sort of October 2008 into January 2009, and it was a coordination of different of responses, monetary and fiscal responses around the world. And because of that coordination, you actually had a relatively smooth recovery out of the crash. What's happened this time around is a complete breakdown of international cooperation. It's just not happening. In fact, most of the countries are spending a great deal of time trying to point at other people, essentially for their own domestic failures. If you have the government here saying, look at China, it's because they failed. They absolutely catastrophically failed, I think, to deal with this crisis over February to March. So, of course, you're going to point at China. Donald Trump is doing exactly the same thing. China, for its part, is busy trying to point at other countries in the rest of the world. There is no meaningful international cooperation, apart from what's taken place around some of the healthcare, where scientists have been busily sharing, details on the genome of the virus, details on research about who's affected by it, that sort of thing. That's been very, very positive. But the formal structures of how the world economy is organised have really not worked properly. And to that extent, it's a bit of an acceleration of what we've seen over the last sort of 10 years or so, which is most of the formal structures of the world economy in terms of international cooperation started to break down. So you have a US-China trade war. You have the failure of the EU to deal with the Eurozone crisis, like 5-10 years ago, and a similar failure occurring now. So from that point of view, it's quite bleak. Like, the international cooperation isn't there, and we're seeing countries retreat back to themselves a lot more. If you want a socialist response to this, then the first one, I think, is we have to recover better. That means the government assistance has to be in place for as long as is necessary for that recovery to happen. I think we need to talk about a recovery in which jobs are good and secure, not jobs that are as shaky as the ones that we've created here. And I think a large part of that is going to have to be the kind of demands around the Green New Deal for decarbonisation and all the rest of it. And that's a kind of outline programme of what a recovery looks like. What we're going to get with this government is some parts of that, elements of that around regional investment, but mostly it's going to be the way we're going to get growth back is get rid of regulations, get rid of restrictions on what capital does, get rid of workplace protections, ban trade unions from operating effectively where you can. And that's how we're going to try and deliver growth. I'll just turn the light on. Sorry, I was disappearing into the gloom there slightly. I hope that's a bit better.
I'm sorry, I think I'm going to do the same. Actually, it's getting dark in this room. So kind of moving away from coronavirus now, you're a vocal opponent of modern monetary theory. For those of us unfamiliar with MMT, would you be able to explain what it is and what your objections to it are?
Well, modern monetary theory is a sort of update of some truisms, really, about how the economy operates with a political shell attached, and the truisms are fine. Like, big claims that MMT makes are governments can't really run out of money. They can just have a central bank that issues money, and that can pay for spending, and that can pay for whatever else you want to do. That's the big central claim they make. And there's then some more complicated bells and whistles people have, and that's the fundamentals of it. Basically, that's true. If a government wants to issue money, it can do. If a government just wants to print money to pay for stuff, it can. There are consequences of this, and then I think there's an argument with MMT people about what those consequences are. Traditionally, people would fixate on the idea of inflation going up as a result of the government printing money. That, at this point in time, probably isn't such a problem, particularly when you have a catastrophic recession and lots of people are not able to spend money because all the shops are shut and you're supposed to stay at home, that kind of thing. The more likely consequences of it, and this is my problem for this country, is that if you say, well, the government's just going to print as much money as it wants, you'll find that because we have such an internationalized financial system here, the money you're trying to print as the Bank of England is not, in fact, the money that your financial institutions want. They want dollars. And if you can't issue dollars because you're the Bank of England, so you can't, you're not able to do very much about them being hit by crises, which means that your economy is very much exposed. Now, there is a sort of twist in this, which is, you saw this in 2008 to 9. The same thing has happened in this crisis, where the Federal Reserve, which is the US central bank, it's the primary source of, or the ultimate source of dollars, it can issue dollars to the rest of the world, has opened what are called swap lines, which are assistance offered to other central banks if they need cheap dollars rapidly. So the Federal Reserve basically says, you're the Bank of England, you're the Bank of Japan, you're the European Central Bank, and there's a few others. You might need dollars quickly because your financial institutions need dollars because they've done all these trades all over the world and now they have a big dollar requirement, but it's a crisis. They can't get dollars. So we, the Federal Reserve, will give you those dollars. You can give them to your banks, and then the whole system will hopefully not plunge into crisis and your banks won't go bankrupt and that sort of thing. So that's a swap line. And they were opened in early 2009 and then closed again once the crisis had died down a bit. The Federal Reserve has opened them in a massive scale this time round. Adam Tooze has written a lot about this, and his book Crashed is very good on the details of it in the crisis last time. So that is quite a powerful instrument for the Federal Reserve to have against other countries. If you have a large internationalized financial system, if you have banks that have lots and lots of liabilities in dollars, and the Federal Reserve is there able to offer dollars so your banks don't crash, that puts the Federal Reserve in a powerful position. So the basic problem in modern monetary theory is, yes, governments can issue money, but that doesn't mean they can just control the entirety of what happens in the economy. There are other powerful factors out there, like your banks need dollars. So the Federal Reserve really is the important player here that makes it such a problem. The big political part of this is, I think, far too many MMT people who are very enthusiastic about this. And some of the scholars writing this end up attached to a version of economic nationalism. They end up with some quite ugly politics associated with MMT, but that's more of a political objection to the movement. I know that there has been a row amongst modern monetary theorists about what they do about some elements of the far right trying to make use of these ideas.
Yeah, thank you for that. So obviously we have a new Shadow Chancellor now. What would you like to see the policy priorities to be from Anneliese Dodds?
Well, I mean, the policy, I must say I was very happy when Anneliese got appointed. She did a really good job in John's Shadow Treasury team, and people have seen she's very, very, very smart, very diligent, really like on the case and knows her stuff in terms of the economics. But I think the immediate priority is actually kind of what they're doing, which is picking out this problem in the government's provision, which is not big enough. It's not covering a whole number of people. There are people falling through the gaps. That's a central thing, economic claim there. The next one is, because we are going to get through this crisis. I think the next week or so is going to be very unpleasant in terms of the number of cases and number of deaths. But we know that these things will peak and we know it's going to come down. And now that we are doing a lockdown, that peak is going to be reduced. So this is good. It's still disastrously bad and worse than it needed to be, but it's good. As we get out of that, talk will turn to how do we recover, what do we do? And I think it's important then that the Labour Party in general, Shadow Chancellor in particular, starts to lay down some markers for what this looks like. Because if we say the priority now is to get growth as rapidly as possible, therefore we cut taxes for businesses, we cut regulations, we get rid of trade unions, we get rid of any barriers to business investment, this is precisely the wrong thing to do. What we need is a managed recovery where we get to somewhere better than what we had before. So that means more investment in the rest of the country, investment in green jobs and good, secure jobs, more rights at work, not less, better protections for people working, particularly if we're trying to come out of this lockdown. We need those protections. People need to know that the future's secure. I think a lot of people are going to be shaken up by this. They're not going to go out spending wildly if they know there's a risk of the virus coming back for a second wave, which of course there is. So the protection needs to be maintained. And that's the kind of managed recovery that I think the Shadow Treasury team is going to have to lay out or start laying out fairly soon.
So final question from me. What was your favourite economic policy from the 2019 Labour manifesto?
Oh, God, there's so many to choose from, of course, notoriously. I would say that I really like the inclusive ownership fund. So this was the idea. I think it became slightly mangled in the implementation or the proposed implementation. But this was the idea that you're going to get shares in large companies to workers in those companies. I think coming out of this, looking much further ahead, the future for having a left that can do anything and speaking a language that people understand and understand how the world operates and how you're going to adapt to this, a major part of that, I think, is going to be the idea of decentralization, of collective ownership on a decentralized basis, not nationalization, put everything in the government and take it away to Whitehall, but giving people some sense of power and ownership in their local communities, in their workplaces, and giving them a meaningful means of control and ownership over the wealth of society. That, I think, is where we need to get to. That's a rather broad brush description of it. But if we get to there, that I think starts to give us quite an attractive way of talking about what the future economy looks like. That it isn't going to be, just here is a big government. Of course, we want a bigger government. We want more NHS, but it isn't just going to be, we've now nationalised the water system. Government will sort it all out. I think to build a kind of resilient economy, it's going to have to be much more decentralised, much more local ownership of things. People having a better sense of how the economy operates, because once you see how the economy operates, you understand how it operates and you understand how resilient it is or isn't. That's the sort of place we need to get to, and that would be an attractive way of thinking about a new economic programme for Labour.
Okay, I think we'll take questions from people. If people want to send their questions into the chat, and read out some of them. I think we already have some actually.
God, there's loads. Should I pick them, or do you want to pick them?
You can pick them if you want. If there's any.
Okay, I'll just go for the easier ones if that happens. But it's like, just may not be the best thing to do. Okay, right. Hello. Mariana Mazzucato, I'm doing an easy one. Mariana Mazzucato has been brought into Keir Starmer's financial advisory team. She has an MMT background, but has also been endorsed by the Pope. What do you think about that? Well, the Pope has good economics on the whole. I mean, questioning some other decisions, but his economics is pretty good. Mariana's not MMT. As far as I know, she comes from a sort of post-Keynesian back. This is getting too much into the detail, but modern monetary theory is a variant of post-Keynesianism. Mariana is close to post-Keynesianism in terms of how she thinks about the world, and that means she tends to stress the idea that if you want to talk about how wealth is created in society, it's not just the private sector does everything and then the public sector leeches off it. The two have to work together. So she gives the famous example of the iPhone. I mean, it's a big private sector company making these things, but the research behind it is all from the public sector. So how do you get the touch screen? How do you get the hard drive? This is all public sector research. You have to have the two together to make the thing work. So broadly, if she's on board with Keir Starmer's new financial advisory team, this is a very good thing. And she was also there advising John McDonnell, so here's some continuity in this. I know she's also close to Chi Onwurah, who's in the Bayes team and doing a lot of work around the digital economy. So that's a positive thing. If you ask me what I think about this, worker owned rather than state owned, yes, exactly. I think that's key. That we shouldn't just have a model of common ownership, which is like either it's privatized or government owns it. We ought to have an idea that there's a spectrum of different things you could be doing here. So it could be local public ownership. You might have local ownership of renewable energy production. It could be worker ownership. We should have more companies which are owned by their employees. There's a whole range of benefits you get out of that. They tend to think longer term. They tend to be better at retaining their workers. They invest more. They pay better. They're more productive. You can carry on with these sort of desirable features of them. But more generally also, like, we have a horrible concentration of the wealth of company ownership in this country. It's wealth in general is very, very concentrated. It's a very unequal society. But company ownership wealth is very, very much concentrated. So the more worker ownership you have, the more you spread that wealth around. There should be greater emphasis. Oh, no, hang on, sorry.
This one would be interesting from William. In a post-tax before spending UK, what is the press-ready answer to, okay, but how are you going to pay for it?
I did see that one. Hang on. How are you going to pay for all this? Yeah, that's going to come up as a question increasingly, I think. And look, there are the answer I think we need to give, because there will be other answers presented. The answer I think we need to give is one that John McDonnell's raised and a few people have talked about, which is that we are making this exceptional spending now. There are people out there who benefited from exceptional spending in 2008 to 9. There are people out there who've benefited very much from quantitative easing over the last few years. This is the top end of society, and there is a solid case for saying we need something like a one-off wealth tax to pay for at least some part of this spending. The other bit of this is to say that, look, this was an exceptional period of crisis. It's comparable to what happens in wartime. And if you take what happened in World War II, debt to GDP, the amount of debt relative to the size of government went up to like 200%. And then over the next 10, 20 years, that was steadily wound down. We can treat it like that. We don't have to rush to pay this off straight away. We know that if the economy is growing, and with a reasonable amount of inflation, but you don't have to say this, with a growing economy, you can steadily wind down your debt. And that is one of the ways in which you might do this. There are more radical proposals out there. You could start to talk about a debt write-off. If debt becomes very, very high, there is a case of saying it is too high to ever plausibly be repaid. Therefore, there's a case of debt write-off. For Britain, this would be, this simply hasn't happened before in this country. Britain is one of 6, I think, countries worldwide. It's about 6 worldwide that have never written off their government debt. So it'd be a huge step. But if the crisis really does worsen, that's going to be a demand that appears. But I don't think we need to touch it for now. My preferred version of how you pay for it is talking about a wealth tax and talking about getting the burden of this onto the top end of the spectrum. Because as I said, the impact of this crisis right now is felt most heavily by some of the poorest and most vulnerable and certainly some of the most insecure workers in society. We're making huge demands of people who work in the NHS, huge demands of people who work for Amazon or any other delivery company, or people have to work in shops selling food still. All the people doing essential work are really having to bear the brunt of this. They're the most exposed. People might have seen the autonomy, the think tank research on who is at the most risk of coronavirus. If you look by occupation, it's often the poorest paid and the most essential people. These should not be the people, having taken that risk, who then have to pay for the economic consequences of it. It should be there on the richest, who frankly have done extremely well over the last 10 years, and everyone else has suffered austerity. And really, I think it's time to sort of redress some of that balance. So that would be my preferred answer. Do you want to pick another question so I don't just pick an easy one?
Just seen a good follow-up, and I feel like I'll ask it because it's from our COVID-19. Would you change the way we campaign and speak about it as a party?
Sorry, you went a bit fuzzy, so I didn't quite catch the end.
From Tom Miller, how popular do you feel our economic platform was in 2019, and would you change the way we campaign and speak about it as a party?
There was a problem in 2019 of the whole being less than the sum of its parts. That most of I think all of the individual policies are basically popular, but once you stack them all up like this, they looked implausible. And there's an element, I mean, frankly, there's a degree in which people thinking that this is a big list of things you want to do is kind of true. Like if you take the 2019 manifesto, this is way beyond what you can do in 5 years. It's clearly a sort of 10-year proposal. And some of those things are going to be aspirations at the end of 10 years. If you're saying we're going to decarbonize the entire economy rapidly, and we're going to fix the NHS, and we're going to make sure everybody's schools are paid for and properly provided. And by the way, here's a whole load of other things we want to do about how you work and how companies are governed. This is an enormous set of proposals. And the problem we had in 2019 was it just wasn't focused. If you had 1 or 2 things you say, and you could pick from all of that what was going to be the message, what was going to be the priority in government, and just hammer that, we'd have been in a better place. By the end of the campaign, that was starting to happen. We had the focus on the NHS, and then John obviously talking about what his first 3 things would be in the first 100 days of a Labour government. So you focus it. So we didn't have that, and I think it just lost credibility as a result. It's a shame because I think we had worked quite hard to build up at least some degree of credibility over the preceding period, and a large part of that is being disciplined about what you say you're going to do and not trying to say too much, because I don't think people believe it. There's an immense amount of cynicism out there about what government can do. Kind of understandably, after 10 years of austerity, what most people's experience in government is that things steadily just get worse and worse. So to turn around and say, we're going to make government really big and it's all going to be great, stretches credulity, I think, for a large number of people. So that would be not just some messaging, but also political strategy. What are the key things that you want to do in the economy? And then how do we talk about them? Not just, here's all the things you want to do, let's do the talking a bit better. Although I think we should also do the talking a bit better.
I'm seeing messages on public ownership of broadband. I guess, what do you think about policy? Do you think, we found with the coronavirus situation now, this is the perfect time to start the conversation around it, because we didn't really have that debate before the 2019 general election? Yeah,
look, no one can seriously deny that broadband's an essential utility now. There was lots of rather, I thought, foolish harumphing and scoffing before the 2019 election that broadband is just ridiculous. This is luxury, this stupid, futile thing. Why are we even talking about this? It's actually nonsensical. I thought Sam Tarry gave a really good answer in the campaign on this, which is actually, if you think about what broadband is and how you might deliver it to everyone, particularly very fast broadband, if you're saying you want to rebuild the economy, you want to deliver investment to places that haven't had it, somewhere in the north of England for a very long period of time, a key part of that is having really good broadband, because then you can have businesses that are straight online, it's reliable, it's always there. Or you can have people working from home or setting up their own businesses from home. You expand the possibilities here. This is how you develop a modern economy. And broadband provision in Britain is notoriously quite bad. So you want to do something about this. The mistake, I thought, in 2019 was to not talk about so much what you were going to do with the broadband, but end up talking about the process by which you deliver it, which is nationalise Openreach. There are other ways to do this, but that's the one that was picked. And there was no reason to get into that. You could have just said, we're going to do this, and then we'll have a consultant how we're going to make it happen as rapidly as possible. It wasn't necessary to tangle the two things up together. But I think we should now be saying that universal broadband, fast, delivered to everyone, and ideally free of charge, is actually a fundamental of how we now live in society, and the next Labour programme should include a commitment like that. And it should be phrased in terms of, this is a human right, we know it's essential because of this experience that we're all now going through, and it's an essential part of economic development for those bits of the country that haven't seen much economic development. That's how you package it. Don't get carried away talking about nationalising Openreach or whatever. I've got a couple of questions on inclusive ownership funds about relating to Sweden and how the Meidner funds, which were similar, failed there back in the 90s. And also one, why is it that you have worker ownership and inclusive ownership funds rather than state ownership or society ownership, which is what the Swedish Meidner funds asked for. Without getting too much into the sort of wonky details in this, the inclusive ownership funds was this scheme that if you work for a large company, you would be over time given a share. You, the workforce of that company, would be given a collective share in that company. So gradually you start to turn every large company into something a bit like John Lewis, up to about 10% of the company. So it's a worker-owned form. This is a decentralized version of ownership because you own it at the company level. The Meidner funds, named after the economist for the Swedish TUC, effectively, who devised the scheme, was doing that, slowly converting big companies into worker ownership, but the funds were held by unions at the national level. And this, in practice, and this is why I think the scheme failed, it meant that the workers who notionally owned those companies were completely detached from the ownership because it's all at the national level through a union federation. So they had no immediate connection to it. So if you decentralize the ownership, if you say, this is literally your company, you literally own it, you will make decisions that, because you're an owner now, have an immediate impact on what the company does, you build in that level of support. You give people a meaningful sense of ownership. So that was the idea, was to get out of the problem that the Meidner funds had, which was to centralize ownership and then give workers a part of that. In fact, it was just to give them direct ownership straight away, so they had a stake in the company. That was the thinking behind it. Should I pick another one, or do you want to?
There's a question on the Preston model.
Yep.
Do you see the Preston model playing a big role, or do you think it should play a big role in the coronavirus recovery?
It should do, because I think it should play a big role anyway. And we talk about it a lot, but it's also, if you're in opposition for 4.5 years, then you have to do something with your time. And there's lots of Labour councils out there, many of them very, very good and thinking innovatively. And this is the Preston model provides a sort of set piece on what you might want to do locally. That's one part of it. So we should be doing this anyway. In terms of the recovery, I think if you're talking about a genuinely resilient economy, it can't be one that's dependent on, first of all, a very few sectors. So, in 2008 to 9, we ended up with far too much of our tax base was dependent on financial services. Financial services take a hit, your tax base is wiped out, and then suddenly you're in a deep recession and the deficit balloons and it's very bad. That is not a resilient economy. If you have one with more sectors, like you had an economy that was producing wealth in lots of different ways, you get a hit to one of those sectors, it doesn't matter so much. You get a hit to all of them, all right, everybody's affected, but you can spread the burden around a bit. So that's one part of it. If you then talk about local economies, if you just have one big employer, I mean, this is the Preston story. They were going to have one big employer who pulled out of a project in the middle of the recession after 2008, and it was disastrous for the town. If instead you have lots and lots of small businesses locally that are well provided for financially, so you have banks that can supply them credit and capital, you have guaranteed purchasing systems that the local council says we will procure locally, big local employers procure locally, you have some of those companies at least are worker owned, so they just tend to be more resilient, people make longer term decisions. If you have all that on a local basis, you have a more resilient economy if something turns up and whacks everybody. That's what you're going to get. So in terms of building a resilient economy, a large part of it has to be that kind of dispersion of ownership, the localization, and therefore a large part of it has to be something like the Preston model as a route to recovery, I would say. What's next?
I saw a question about Brexit, which is something that we never talk about anymore. I think it was something like, do you think the government should extend the transition period for Brexit, and what would the implications of that be?
Oh God, Brexit. Yeah, it's true. I mean, look, almost as soon as it happened, it suddenly disappeared. The government didn't talk about it anymore. They were like, get Brexit done, it's done. This, I think, has pushed it even further off. They're going to have to extend the transition period. I don't see any plausible means by which they're going to insist, after all this, and potentially with the crisis still going on at the year's end, they're going to insist on leaving the European Union, actually properly leaving the European Union, without a deal in place. It just stretches credulity to think that they're going to behave like that. I always thought that the no-deal Brexit was overhyped as something the government would actually do. It was there as a not very effective negotiating tool with the EU, and there as a way to frighten people rather more than they're ever going to do it. So my working assumption is they will extend the transition period because they have very, very few choices. Bear in mind, Brexit is a huge demand on the civil service. So simply in terms of government capacity, they can't both deal with the coronavirus and its consequences, which is an enormous demand in government capacity, and then also try and prepare for Brexit. Everybody's been switched. Civil servants have all been switched from Brexit preparations to coronavirus. They can't do both. So they're going to have to extend. Political consequences of this, I think, will be significantly reduced relative to what they might have been before coronavirus, because the coronavirus has happened, and all political consequences from this point onwards are kind of washed out by the longer term implications of that.
So I think from Joe, Joe, the editor of the Social Review, you recently obviously wrote the article about Labour's legal turn. Would you be able to expand? What do you mean by that? What does that look like?
Okay, well, I suppose it was two parts or three parts to the argument here that we'd ended up with an argument in 2019. It wasn't quite, I'm going to parody it a bit, but it was basically like, let's get the government to make it bigger. So if you have more government doing things, this is basically better than less government doing things. Therefore, we're going to make government bigger. So 2019 manifesto, in the aggregate, is a big plan to expand the state's role in the economy. So government spends more on the NHS and public services, and it intervenes more. And the argument in the legal turn paper is to say that, okay, first, this isn't really an adequate answer to a bunch of the challenges we're now likely to face. There's a very, very good article by J.S. Tan, I think it might be a pseudonym, on Tribune, talking about the consequences of introducing contact tracking into Britain. Now, contact tracking is the way you can get out in relatively good order of a lockdown, because you say, what we're going to do is test as many people as we can and then trace where they've been, who else they've talked to. And we can do that because everyone has a mobile phone. So it's pretty intrusive in terms of people's privacy, because you're having to track where people are going and who else they've seen. But you do that in order to trace where the virus is likely to go. And if you can do that, you can start to control the virus. And this is basically what South Korea has been doing, which is probably the best model, the closest available model for what you might want to do here. All of which is fine, all of which is basically it's a public health emergency. You have to do something like this. But of course, that does mean handing over a load of data, potentially quite personal data, to the government. And then the second stage of it is, if you look at the NHS app that is being developed to do this, it's being developed in conjunction with Google and Apple. So in other words, you're handing over potentially even more data, which is hugely valuable to two already very big, very dominant companies in the digital sphere. So if you had a model which was just like, make government bigger, well, we don't necessarily just want government to be bigger when it comes to like personal data. And if you had a model which was make government bigger, but in order to get this to work, we're going to have to rely on big data providers. Again, you're not in quite the right place here. You're just handing over more wealth to big data via government. That's why these companies are interested in doing this. They want the valuable data out of this on the other side. So the question you want to ask is, what is the legal form of ownership of that data? Who actually controls and owns it, and how can we do this in a way that's fair and democratic and all the rest of it? So things like data trusts, for example, would be a way to resolve this. This is no longer just talking about, is this public versus private? What you're dealing with here is a sort of interaction of the two things. It is a public health emergency. The government is intervening. To do so, it has to get private sector in as well. And it creates a huge, basically, economic problem, which is what happens to all this valuable data. So you need a kind of legal approach. That's one part of it. The other part is, how do we think a bit more deeply about what a business is and how it operates? How do we start to change some of the functioning of a business and what we conceive of a business? It's not just here is private owned business and it just maximizes profits, and publicly owned business, it just has political control. There's many, many other ways we can start to think about this. So that's what I meant by the legal term. It's the idea that we're not just sort of public versus private, and we're not just about building new institutions, the so-called institutional term. It's about how you get into the legal framework of how an economy operates and get it to function better when we are confronted with, and we're going to be increasingly confronted with, problems where it is the public sector plus the private sector together that is a problem. So you can't just go make government bigger. You have to do something a bit more sophisticated.
I see a question here on the Green New Deal, which we actually covered much. So how do we shift the focus of our economy away from oil and fossil fuel companies?
It's sort of happening anyway. All of the fossil fuel companies are facing this problem now, that they are sitting on reserves or claimed reserves that they won't be able to use. The value of an oil company is basically set by the amount of reserves it says it has. And if people believe it, then that's how much it's going to be worth. So the game with oil companies previously was always to try and search more and more reserves, and then say you've got them, and therefore you become very valuable, because you know if a company has ownership over those reserves, it can keep going for a long period of time, make a load of money. The economics of oil production is pretty crude, so to speak, like that. That becomes really difficult. Never mind your reserves are running out. It becomes really difficult if you can't actually use those reserves. And same goes for coal mining and other very carbon intensive sort of fossil fuel industries. It's a real crisis for them, and it's a real crisis for people invested in them. And until COVID-19 blew up, the Bank of England was actually probably one of the leading institutions trying to get financial companies to think about making their investments with a view to the fact that you can no longer invest in fossil fuels. So it was already happening that money was being pulled out of the fossil fuel sector, because everybody recognized that this was not a long-term viable prospect. The fossil fuel companies themselves are starting to try and adapt to a world that looks like this. Not particularly quickly, because they are actually locked into the technology that's already there. So how do you get the whole economy to shift like this? I think there's been some good work done around the transition on a sector-by-sector basis, that we have to put in place the mechanisms by which you get people currently working. In oil in particular, it's lots and lots of highly skilled jobs, often in places where there may not be lots of other work. You know, if you pull oil out of Aberdeen, it damages the economy very, very severely there. So you don't want to do that, but you do have to try, and you do want to try and use those skills and convert some of the things that people are doing now into more, socially, what would you say, less environmentally destructive purposes. So there has to be put in place an industrial strategy with the idea of a just transition. This was at the heart of a Green New Deal and the kind of promises made around that. If you can do that, then you can start to wind down those industries in a way that doesn't hurt the people working in them. That's your starting point. The bigger picture, I think, is not just investment in renewables and obvious green technologies. The bigger picture, I think, is increasingly going to be kind of lifestyle changes, but this done in a way that people will want. So done in a way that would mean, for instance, working less, so you travel to work less. One of the simplest things we can do to immediately start to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is to have people work less, because they commute less. And if they commute less, they travel less. And if you travel less, you burn less fuel. So you can instantly see, you can rapidly see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions there. But this is going to be a change in how people work. This potentially is a change in how people work coming out the other side of the current crisis, but nonetheless it is a change. If you can start to put all these things together, that's how the whole economy can start to move in a more environmentally sustainable way. Just one other thing, something we've never made enough of is the idea of the circular economy. I think Kate Rowse and a few other people have talked about this, where instead of continually producing new things, we start to get much better at recycling the old and reusing the old and repurposing the old, reprogramming the old, so that you instead of rushing off to buy new trainers or a new car every year or whatever it might be, we're actually just making better use of the things already produced. Again, lots of big environmental impacts from this. You reduce your impact in the world, and also the potential to create lots and lots of jobs.
An interesting follow-up question from Julie Ward around the Green New Deal. What about diversification, so shifting production from arms to socially useful production, such as ventilators?
Well, exactly, and we're sort of demonstrating that it can be done, and it turns out that this isn't a barrier. There are technical barriers to doing this, but beyond that, there's no reason why you can't shift arms production into doing something more socially useful. This is now actually being attempted. You can repurpose production quite rapidly. We should remember that this was done during this crisis. If we ever confront an argument which says, oh, we can't possibly stop whoever, Rolls-Royce, building jet engines and get them into producing wind turbines, it's far too difficult. Well, hang on, we've done it for ventilators, so why can't we do it for lots and lots of other things instead? Clearly we have the skills and the capital and the equipment to be able to do this. What's lacking is the political will to make that happen. So I think it's a really good argument to use.
Do you think that the Green New Deal policy in its 2019 Labour manifesto incarnation rises up to the challenge of climate change, as much as the UK can at least contribute towards solving this?
I think it addresses some of this. It sets a good aspiration, which is, well, a goal really, which is to get to 70-ish% of current emissions by 2030, and then reduction afterwards. So it's correct in terms of the aspiration to front load the changes. This is one of the things you need to do for decarbonisation, is do that as rapidly as possible. So it's good in it's doing that. I think where it starts to, it's good in the sense of being a very detailed set of proposals into what your economy starts to look like. I think where it starts to fall down is, at first, it is only about, or very, very much focused on decarbonisation. There's nothing about biodiversity loss, for example, not as part of the Green New Deal, it's elsewhere in the manifesto, but it needs to be integrated. And by the way, I take the point from Julie Ward about the circular economy. I think that part of it needs to be built in. We need a much more comprehensive environmental transformation of the economy than the Green New Deal offered, because it was decarbonisation and most things, they're there and there's other policy, but it's not part of the whole. I don't think it goes far enough in talking about the kind of lifestyle changes and working changes that I've spoken about. That it needs to be, if you're saying let's have a 4-day week, this should be integrated into your decarbonisation plan. This is part of the same thing. This is a good way to decarbonise. It needs to be part of the programme. And you need to do it in a way that people believe, rather than just think, what are you talking about? So that's another bit of it. And the final part is, I just thought it was far too state-centred. We have limited civil service time. We need to decarbonise rapidly. So you need a very clear list of priorities for that civil service to do, to be able to perform that. And we need lots and lots of decentralisation for everybody else to be able to do it on the ground. So it needs to have much more stress on getting other people to decarbonise, rather than government will tell you to do these things. So that's how we decarbonise. I think in the space of time, imagine we form a majority government, not totally implausible, but possible. And frankly, coming out of this crisis, I think the question is going to be wide open. In 5 years' time, 2025, that would give us 5 years to meet a 2030 target, right? The pace of decarbonisation at that point has to be rapid, and it is beyond the capacity of government to deliver something like that. So it has to be a decentralised version of the Green New Deal that we're looking to in the future.
An interesting question from Camille here, who works in academic scholarship and green open access. Do you have any views on the huge publishing monopolies, open access being the thing that may help us find a vaccine for COVID-19?
This, I think, is a great question. It's one of the things we didn't do enough of, and we never quite had it on the list to properly deal with. Under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership was the question of intellectual property, and being much more radical about what IP is, and how we can use the information that's generated in a much more socially useful fashion. If we have a legal term, then a part of it is going to have to be addressing how intellectual property is treated in this country. And you can see, the consequences of making more things open access is that we now have much, much better research on vaccines than we would have had if everything was still locked in these silos and kept as private information. The data sharing by researchers over the last few months has been this sort of spectacular new thing that can happen. I mean, it didn't even happen with the SARS outbreak in the same way in 2003. It can now happen. It means we can advance much more rapidly to getting a vaccine. It's a huge net benefit to humanity. So I would very much like to see, coming out of this, Labour taking a position of much looser defence of intellectual property, particularly around things like artificial intelligence, much more use of open access, and starts to talk seriously about making the information that's there as far as possible, making it free. Turn towards using open source, so it would be sensible, saying that we're going to have this as standard in government, that kind of thing. So I think it's a very good question. I think there's an important range of work to be done there in developing policy around it. It didn't quite happen in the way it should have done under Jeremy Corbyn. I think that was an error not to think about these things.
I think we've touched upon quite a wide range of topics in the questions. Are there any that stand out to you that you'd like to address?
Let me have a quick scroll through. Yeah, it's covered all sorts. It's two of them. Oh, God. I think we've covered most of the things that have been raised here, which is Green New Deal, UBI, that sort of thing. If people are sort of happy with that, I hope it's covered most of the questions that have been raised one way or the other. I realise I've been talking quite a lot by this point.
I think that was like wide-ranging, which was useful. I guess maybe two last questions then, potentially. One, what do you think is the way forward for the left in the party?
Well, that's you see, saving the sort of harder ones for last. And talk quite happily about economics for ages, but then like, what does the left actually do at this point? And frankly, this one otherwise it gets resolved on Twitter and all sorts of other not very helpful forums. I think the first one is a recognition that the left isn't literally just, you know, Rebecca Long Bailey, 4-day week and 3-day bender, or whatever the slogan was, right? We have to have a sense that the left isn't just this kind of fairly narrowly defined set of requirements. There are many, many more people out there. And it would be very helpful for everyone to have that in mind and assume people are acting, whether they are or they aren't, but at least acting it with some degree of good faith and proceed on that basis. I think that would be the sensible way to proceed. So the first one is, can we stop rowing at each other over sort of pre-existing factional lines? My strong suspicion is two things, really. One is that coming out of the Jeremy Corbyn experience, if you like, is that a lot of the left is just getting shaken up anyway. Jeremy Gilbert had a very COVID-19 0-day week, 7-day bender. Thanks for that. The Jeremy Gilbert had a very good piece on like the new divisions on the left, defining it as a soft left, the orthodox left, and the radical left. And that's actually not a bad way to think about where people are. But I think it's also important to not try and make these hard and fast boundaries between those three sets of people. That's the first one. The second one is I think the COVID crisis is going to throw open a whole load of questions around what is it to be on the left anyway. I touched on some of it around the issues of data and management of data. You know, nationalising Facebook isn't an option and may not be particularly desirable. A kind of orthodox left answer to data problems is not necessarily where you want to get to. So that I think is part of where we're going to end up with lots and lots of pre-existing boundaries shaken up. Now, that's not very helpfully getting you anywhere. My own feeling is that certainly for the left in general, that we need to drop some of the, it probably doesn't apply too much to open Labour people, but I think there's a bit of the left that's sort of on automatic criticism of everything the leadership does, in not the most helpful way going. And I think looking ahead, I think it's important to have critical voices. And I think it's important to be able to say, actually, we disagree with this or we disagree with that. But it can't be just you're just crap and I'm going to find a way to shout at you regardless. I don't think that's particularly helpful. I think offering a constructive alternative suggestions, a constructive criticism is the best way to proceed around this leadership. And again, I think acting on the basis of good faith, it's sorely tested in all sorts of different ways in the Labour Party and on the left in general. But I think acting with the belief that other people are sincere about what they're doing and we can find a way through this is a better way forward than immediately looking for factional divisions and sticking to them.
Yeah. I think also generally moving discussion off of Twitter, which probably isn't conducive to good debate and discussion. So final question, which I think is quite a nice one from Martin. Do you have any, given the crisis and so on and everyone's in lockdown, do you have any economics books or articles, documentaries or podcasts that you would recommend to anyone interested in it?
God, well, I mean, everybody's in lockdown, so they've got a lot of time for reading. Adam Tooze's Crashed it's been slightly superseded by current events, but it's really, really good account of what's happened in the last 10 years up until like February this year. So definitely have a read of that. In fact, his output on all of the crisis, and he's like phenomenally productive, has been very, very good throughout. So his stuff is well worth reading. Other things I've seen recently, what on earth have I been reading? Fossil Capital by Andreas Malm is a brilliant sort of environmental economist's account of the rise of capitalism and how we got here today. And then there is a book called The New Machine Age, and I'm pretty certain I've just got that title wrong, on the impact of automation, which is also well worth digging out.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us, and thank you to everyone who participated in this conversation. Is any last words or?
No, that was all. Thank you very much for having me. I hope people found that useful.
I think it was
I'll leave you to your Tuesday evenings. Okay, thank you.
And as someone who doesn't really know much about economics, I think I learned a lot from that. So thank you.
There we go. All right, thank you then. Thanks. See you all.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.